All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome back for week number 3 at PPA 660 Organization Theory. Hope you're doing well and that your week is off to a very good start. This is our third week together, and so our purpose for this week is to begin introducing those schools of thought that we'll be covering throughout the remainder of the course. And so the first school of thought we're going to talk about tonight is classic organization theory. The classical school, as we had talked about, I kind of foreshadowed it last week and the week before that. Really, we're talking about a chronological period of time from the late 1800s, moving up to the mid 1900s, 1940s or so. And so this is what we'll consider to be our classical school. But before we get into that, let me just say thank you for your Canvas essays. All those posts that came in by about 4 o'clock today, I've had a chance to take a look at and provide some feedback on. Again, they're very well done. I'm very happy with them, and so just keep doing what you are doing. For Canvas essay number 3, that's going to come due then for next week. We are going to be drawing upon the information we are covering tonight with classical school, taking a look at a couple of the main theorists, Weber and Taylor, and identifying in our organizations where we see Weber and where we see Taylor. And so that's going to be, I believe that's your Canvas essay number 3. What I think we'll do tonight is we'll be able to have plenty of time to get through all of the classical school of organization theory, take a break, then move into our breakout rooms. And I have a little exercise we can do in our breakout rooms. Then once we reconvene as a class after we're done with our breakout rooms, we'll take a look at the clock and see how much time we have left. If there's ample time remaining, we may work ahead a little bit and start to introduce neoclassical school. If not, then we'll just hold off on neoclassical school until next week. So that is the plan for this evening. So we'll see how we progress through the classical school of organization theory. Now, the classical school of organization theory you were introduced to in your PPA 500 course. When we talk organization theory in 500, that's kind of a staple of every section of PPA 500, kind of irrespective of who your instructor is. Different instructors will handle organization a little bit differently in 500, but I'm sure you've covered some of these authors that we are going to talk about tonight. But what we'll do tonight is we will put a little bit more flesh on the bones in terms of providing some more detail, really kind of digging down in some granular details on some of these theories. But most importantly, what we'd like to do is really show some of the commonalities and differences between the different theorists that I like to group together into what I consider to be the classical school. And when you talk classical school, you're always going to start with Max Weber. And you read about Max Weber in 500. You had a reading on Max Weber for our class here tonight. So you're probably already somewhat familiar with Max Weber. Max Weber, when he approaches developing organization theories, he comes to that study from a couple of different backgrounds. And it's kind of important to understand the context and the frame of reference of Max Weber to really understand what he was telling us about organizations and why he was developing what's come to be known as the ideal bureaucratic theory. So Max Weber lived from the 1860s. I believe he passed away in 1920, I believe. A lot of his writing was being done in the late 1800s. Now, if you think about the period of time of the late 1800s, you're a few decades removed from the end of the late period of Enlightenment. And so you're probably familiar with the Enlightenment era. The Enlightenment era that runs from the mid 17th century up to 1815, 1820. And in that Enlightenment era, we really started to question taking things on just belief and just believing things. And instead, we began to replace belief with empiricism. This is all coming on the heels of the Industrial Revolution and the creation of the scientific method. And so we really start to put a lot of our trust in science. So if we want to study organizations, Rather than just studying those organizations based upon what we believe or think or feel an organization should look like, we can actually go and deconstruct that organization to collect empirical evidence, analyze that empirical evidence, and then render conclusions from that analysis of that empirical evidence. So Max Weber, with his writing, was very much influenced by those thoughts from the earlier era of Enlightenment. Now, Max Weber had a background as a sociologist. He was a German sociologist. He also had a background in the study of law, and he applied a lot of legal theory and legal structure to his understanding of organizations. So, this very first theorist, Max Weber, is certainly not a public administration theorist. He does not come from the world of public administration. He comes from outside of public administration. And he is studying organizations more kind of from a writ large perspective, in that he's studying them as organizations as opposed to just studying specifically public organizations. So when Weber starts developing his theory on organization, his theory is going to be very much predicated upon empirical evidence. We all, I think, have a good idea of what empirical evidence is. For something to be empirical, it must be something that we can measure. It must be something that is tangible, information that we can collect, information we can analyze, and then use that analysis to then develop conclusions. So he really wanted to replace belief with empiricism and a reliance upon empirical evidence. He also was a very big believer, as we said, on law. And he believed that if we could apply the laws and rules and regulations in a uniform manner, that would also be a major element of what he considered to be this idealized version of an organization. He was very much a believer in the idea of bureaucracies. He felt that bureaucracies, these types of organizations, these very well structured and run organizations, that those types of bureaucratic organizations were what he considered to be the highest level in rationalization. He really believed that we make our decisions based upon a rational process. We go out there, we collect the information, we analyze it, and we then make decisions. He felt that rationality was best found within these bureaucratic organizations. And so he had a lot of trust, if you will, in the ability of organizations to engage in rational, comprehensive type of decision making. So that's kind of the perspective that Weber comes to his ideal bureaucratic theory from. So he believes that these organizations are kind of the apex of rationality. As the apex of rationality, these organizations have inherent authority. As we talked about last week, some organizations, like we said, public organizations, have this legal authority, and this authority that comes from enabling legislation, and that's an authority that they may have that is absent in the private sector. So it's important for an organization to have this authority. Authority is the ability to influence others to do things they otherwise would not do. And when you influence someone to do something they otherwise would not do, as we talked about last week, that's kind of an exercise of power. So organizations have this inherent ability to, we'll use the word coerce people to take certain types of actions and to influence people. So if these organizations have this type of authority, the question is, which is the preferred type of authority to have? And Weber certainly had his own idea in terms of which of these types of authority would be the preferred type of authority. So in his writings, he identifies for us three different types of authority or three different types of power. The first type of authority is charismatic authority. So in charismatic authority, you oftentimes have leadership coming from the charisma, the characteristics of the leader. So in a charismatic basis for authority, The basis for authority oftentimes resides within the individual leader as opposed to residing within the organization or the position. Clearly, for Max Weber, charismatic type of authority basis was problematic because when you have the authority residing with the individual as opposed to the position, individuals come and go in organizations, positions are much more permanent. And so when you have the authority residing within the individual, when that individual leaves the organization, they will take that authority basis with them when they leave. So it tends to be a much more transitory type of authority basis. So he wasn't a big fan of charismatic authority in organizations. The second basis of authority is what he referred to as traditional authority. A basis of traditional authority means that the authority, the power, comes from the status quo. So it comes from the way in which we've always done things. So you can think about this in terms of in the 15 to 1400s and 1500s and 1600s, the whole idea of a divine right of kings. So the king ruled because the king was a member of that royal family. The ruler would always be from that royal family. And these kings were never wrong because they had this divine right to rule. That's the way it always had been. That was the status quo. That is a traditional basis for authority. And Weber was very well familiar with this traditional type of authority basis because he lived in a nation that had that type of a traditional authority structure. Again, not a terribly big fan of that. The third basis of authority that Weber tells us about is the legal rational basis. And obviously, this is the one that Weber wants to perpetuate with a lot of his theories. So here, the authority comes from law, it comes from empirical evidence, as opposed to coming from a traditional way that we've always done it, or coming from the charisma and the characteristics of one singular leader. So he really feels that the authority basis we should use in our organization should be a legal, rational basis. So he presents to us these three different authority types of bases of authority. The first two, obviously, that he is not a big fan of, it's kind of like in philosophy, you've got this straw man argument. If you ever heard of the straw man argument, the straw man argument is that if you want to prove your point, you then set up all of these other explanations that you can then knock down, that you can show why these other explanations do not work, and then that will then provide you with your evidence that your explanation is the correct one. So really charismatic or charismatic and traditional types of authority bases, those were his straw men, so to speak, that he was setting up to knock down so that he could then convince us of the importance of a legal, rational type of an approach. So these three different authority, I won't say systems, I'll say these three different types of authority or bases of authority then spawn their own types of administrative systems. So, for instance, the charismatic basis of authority would then naturally spawn a type of administration known as charismatic administration. Charismatic administration is obviously administration that is being done by that one singular individual, that one leader who is leading based upon, or they are leading based upon their their force of will, their characteristics, their charisma. Mohammed, go ahead.
Yeah, so you mentioned straw man. I I know when it's normally like mentioned, it's talked about as a like faulty argument. I don't know the exact definition. But can you I know it's a side point, but uh you said knocking down all the opponent's arguments. That seems like a strong way to argue. So can you maybe reconcile these ideas? I know this is not a main point, but
Yeah, well, I think it depends upon the ideas that you are setting up. If you are setting up ideas that you know are not valid, that you know. So say, for instance, that you are doing research. I mean, you've got your multiple regression equation. And so you are then putting forth independent variables that you know are not related to the dependent variable just to show, well, these aren't related, so therefore mine must be related. So if you're putting up these types of explanations that you know going into it are faulty to begin with, that's what is a problem with the straw man type of argument. Because you know it's a straw man when you set it up, but you do it anyway to try and convince your reader. That's what makes it kind of a faulty type of an approach. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense.
Okay, good. That's a good question. So with charismatic administration, we've got this administrative system where you have this one leader, this charismatic leader, and this charismatic leader is leading by the force of their personality. The good thing about a charismatic administrative system is that when you have people following a charismatic leader, they are oftentimes going to follow that leader very closely. They are going to be very loyal to that leader, so it engenders a great deal of loyalty when you have this charismatic type of situation. Clearly, the disadvantage is that it's inherently unstable because if the authority resides within that person leaves the organization, they will take that authority with them. And people follow charismatic leaders for a variety of different reasons. And we'll talk more about this later on in the term when we talk about leadership theory. But there are two different approaches to charismatic leadership. There's what is known as the self-concept theory of charismatic leadership. And in the self-concept theory, people will follow a charismatic leader because they see themselves in that leader. So they can relate to that leader. They see that that leader as being somewhat similar to them. So they relate to them in that self-concept type of an approach. Then the other way in which people follow a charismatic leader is what's known as an attributional type of approach, in that they feel that that leader demonstrates the attributes that that employee really connects with effective leadership. So maybe there's a leader who makes decisions in a decisive way. The follower, the employee will say, well, I think that's part of great leadership is to make those decisive decisions. This leader is exhibiting that attribute, and so therefore I am going to be following that leader. So there are different ways in which people tend to follow charismatic leaders, but again, this charismatic base of authority creates charismatic administration, which can tend to be somewhat unstable. So what Weber's looking for is he's looking for an authority base that's much more within the organization itself. In the second type, the second basis of authority, the traditionalist basis, that traditional basis of authority spawns different types of administrative systems. And the middle three that you see there on the screen for you, the patriarchal, patrimonial, and feudal administrative systems, those three administrative systems all come out of that traditionalist type of authority. So in a patriarchal type of administrative system, you have the administration being done by the leader and oftentimes the family members of that leader. So you don't really have staff carrying these things out. It's kind of akin to a family business. So the member of the family starts the business, gets their family members to work in the business. It's a very tight-knit family business. The decisions are all being made by the family. That's a patriarchal type of administrative system. Obviously, the problem with a patriarchal type of administrative system is that you have a limited scope of what you can manage. If you've got one family of three or four people running this pizza shop, that's about all they're going to be able to manage. They're not going to be able to have other pizza shops opened up all over the city. So that's patriarchal administration. So obviously, that's not going to work all that well for our organizations that tend to be very large and fragmented and diffuse organizations. The second administrative system that flows out of a traditionalist approach is a patrimonial type of administrative system. And a patrimonial type of system, you start to extend the governance a little bit. And so now you start hiring staff. and you start using staff to help you carry out whatever your goals and objectives and plans are. So it starts to go beyond just that nuclear family, but you still have most of the direction coming from this one leader. A third type of administrative system that comes out of the traditionalist approach is the feudal system. And if you study history, especially European history, I'm sure you're very familiar with feudal systems. You know, in feudal systems, the leader, oftentimes from the royal family, will then get their political allies to do their bidding. And oftentimes these political allies will be geographically dispersed. So they'll be, geographically spread out all over the place, but you can get these individuals to do your bidding by providing them with the appropriate incentives. So you provide them with incentives to make them political allies, and then the administration tends to be done then by these political allies. And that's kind of your feudal system. So you provide land to a nobleman at the time. And that nobleman, in exchange for that land, will then try and further what you want to do as king or whatever your title may be. So those are the three administrative systems that tend to come out of the traditional approach. But what we are most concerned about, obviously, is the legal rational approach. And the legal rational approach then spawns our last administrative system, which is bureaucratic administration. And that's the one that we are so familiar with today in our system of career civil service. This is where administration is being done by technical administrators. So the administrators in this bureaucratic organization who are carrying out all these different types of tasks on a daily basis are not related to the leader. They are not necessarily political allies of that leader. They are hired based upon their, as we like to say, KSAs, their knowledge, skills, and abilities. They are the ones who have the technical expertise to be able to carry out these programs and implement these things in an effective and an efficient manner. And so this is obviously what leads Weber directly into his whole idea of the creation of an ideal bureaucratic model. So that's what Weber is most well known for, is Weberian ideal bureaucracy. Now, one of the major parts of Weberian ideal bureaucracy is the pursuit of this idea of a one-size-fits-all approach, that we can create this ideal bureaucratic structure, and we can then apply this ideal bureaucratic structure to all of our organizations, therefore making all of our organizations effective and efficient. We know that today in organization theory, we oftentimes realize that we cannot find that one panacea. There's oftentimes not that one theory that can apply in every single situation. But that was the pursuit under this ideal bureaucratic theory. So that's the first important part of Weber, is that he was looking for that one-size-fits-all approach. The second important feature of Weber is that he was focusing primarily on the structure of the organization. So he was very interested in organization structure. So if you want to look at this in the context of what we talked about last week, this would be much more of a macro level approach to studying organization theory. We are trying to create the ideal organization at that organizational level to make our organizations effective and efficient. So as you probably remember from your 500 class, there are several characteristics that make for an ideal bureaucratic structure. There's division of labor. We are doing a lot of work within our organizations, and so therefore, to get the work done, we need to divide the work up among the members of our organizations. When we divide that work up in division of labor, we are then also engaging in specialization of task. Each individual then gets a certain limited scope of tasks that they are responsible for on a daily basis. They specialize in that portfolio of tasks and do those tasks day in and day out. Obviously, if you have employees who are specializing in specific tasks on a daily basis, then those individual employees are going to become experts. They will be the experts in what they are doing on a day-to-day basis. This again feeds back into that idea we talked about last week of the problem of the principal-agent relationship. This is why those agents in that principal-agent relationship have all the information. This is where that information asymmetry comes from, is their expert status that comes from specialization of tasks, that comes from a division of labor. In terms of the structure of the organization itself, it is a tall hierarchy. So we have one singular individual at the top. We have a secretary or a director or whatever the term may be at the top of that organization. Then as you go down the organization chart, you then encounter more and more positions. The plurality of positions in the organization will then be at the bottom level of that organization chart. So as we know, it takes on that very much of a pyramidal type of shape. Whenever you have a pyramidal shape like that in a tall hierarchy, the decisions tend to flow downhill. So the decisions tend to be made at the top and then flow down the hierarchy. In this tall hierarchy, you have a span of control. So every manager in the organization will be responsible for a limited number of people or a limited number of units below them. So if you are a middle level manager, you are not accountable for every single individual below you in the organization chart. Instead, you will have maybe 5 or 7 or 10 employees you're responsible for. You may have one unit that you're running or a couple units you're running. That is what's known as a limited span of control. When you take a limited span of control and combine it with a tall hierarchy, you end up getting another principle known as unity of command, in that everyone knows to whom they are accountable. So if you want to know who your direct supervisor is, you've got an organization chart that will show you that. If you want to know who that person's supervisor is, you go back to that organization chart. So it's a very regimented, very structured type of organizational system. It is also rule bound in that the decisions that are being made in that organization, because we are basing our decisions on a legal, rational type of an approach, we are going to base our decisions on rules and regulations. The good thing about using rules and regulations is you can protect individual rights by treating people in an equal manner. The rules apply to everyone. The downside, obviously, is red tape. You get too many rules and too many regulations, and you end up with a lot of red tape. In our public organizations, as organizations age and as they grow, they tend to demonstrate this thing known as institutional rigidity. As they become more rigid as organizations, they tend to become more fragmented, developing more positions and more units and more divisions, and also producing more policies and procedures. As we will see in a couple of weeks when we talk about Robert Merton, once you have all of these rules and regulations and policies and procedures, you then have the potential for a dysfunction that Merton refers to as goal displacement. And in goal displacement, in this institutionally rigid organization, our goal, instead of being to serve the wants, needs, and desires of the constituents that we are supposed to serve, our goal then becomes displaced with the goal of adhering to policies and procedures. And so the ultimate goal of the organization is how well have we applied our rules and our regulations and our policies, kind of irrespective of what actual outcomes are accruing for those individuals who are consuming the outputs of the organization. So that's what you sometimes get with institutionally rigid organizations that are too reliant upon too many policies and too many procedures. These experts who work in this ideal bureaucracy are professional administrators. So they are professionals in that they have the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities to carry out their jobs on a daily basis. There are also career administrators in that they view their position as a career. and they view their time in the organization from a very long time perspective, a long-term perspective, in that they see their work in this organization as being the work of a career. Again, later on in the class, we'll talk briefly about people like Uchi and Pullman Texian. And Uchi talks about the importance of what he calls Theory Z management, which is a Japanese style of management where people who work in organizations feel a very close affiliation with those organizations. Such a close affiliation with those organizations that they're in those organizations for life. That's where they are spending their entire careers. So they're not free agents. They're going to bounce around between 5 or 10 different quote unquote jobs over their time of work. They're going to really look at this career, at this organization as being their career. And then, of course, all these rules and regulations are written. It's very important in a legal, rational approach that we write all these things down. We have a lot of written documentation so that we can go back and reference that written documentation in the future. That written documentation provides us with the institutional memory that we need to remain uniform and equal in the way in which we are dealing with people in the future. So this is what Weber refers to as his ideal bureaucratic organization. Again, this one-size-fits-all approach that if we can structure all of our organizations in this manner, this is how we will make our organizations effective. Which then begs the question of, well, how does Weber's ideal bureaucracy measure organizational effectiveness? If the ultimate goal of structuring organizations like this is to make them effective, well, what does effectiveness mean? Well, for Weber and his ideal bureaucracy, his theory will really certainly emphasize the bottom two theories in our matrix of those four organizational effectiveness models. So the rational goal model as well as the internal process model. And this is a pretty easy one to categorize. Clearly the rational goal model, because our ultimate goal is to achieve the goal of creating these products, whatever we're creating in terms of our outputs that meet the needs of our consumers. We're trying to create a quality output. And so we create that quality output by setting our goals, writing our rules and regulations, doing our planning, which will then enhance our productivity and efficiency and allow us to meet our overall goals as an organization. So we clearly are trying to achieve those rational goals. Now, the rational is right there in the name of the model. So clearly that is one of the models that we favor. Then the other model is obviously going to be internal process because we are looking within the organization. We are not looking beyond the walls of the organization. So we're not in an open systems model. We are not looking at trying to satisfy our employees, which would be more of a human relations model. We're looking at those policies and processes and procedures and trying to develop the most efficient policies and procedures as we possibly can do. So obviously what we're trying to achieve here is we're looking to try and build in stability, control with this top-down type of tall hierarchical system that will again allow us to control the processes within our organization. Speaking of control, then the next question is, well, which of the mechanisms for coordination and control do we see used by Weber in his idealized bureaucracy? Well, clearly we've got a whole lot of direct supervision. As we said, this is a tall hierarchy. It's a top-down decision-making type of structure. So decisions are made at the top of the organization and then are given down to lower members of the organization. Clearly, there's a lot of direct supervision. Tompkins would also argue that there's standardization of work processes. And again, I would agree with that because we're really focusing on creating these policies and procedures that everyone will follow in the future. So there's quite a bit of standardization. He also argues there's standardization of worker skills. I can certainly see that because we're putting an emphasis on professional employees who have the knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the job on a daily basis. Tompkins, if you look on page 60, I believe it is. If you look on page 60 with these mechanisms, you'll see that Tompkins does not shade in standardization of work outputs. This is one of those places where in times where I will take a little bit of issue with Tompkins. I do think that there is some standardization of these outputs. We are very much focusing on the quality of the outputs, and it's a kind of the assumption that a quality process will result in a quality output. So if I was putting that chart together, I would probably little bit more lightly, but shade in that idea of standardization of work outputs. Then, in terms of our four motivational strategies, this is very clearly legal compliance. So you are establishing these requirements for employees and how they do the job, and then you are holding them compliant for meeting and adhering to those standards. So very clearly legal compliance. Seeing a focus on direct supervision, legal compliance, standardization, internal process, these are all aspects that are common to the vast majority of our classic organization theorists. So my question to you then, now that we have talked about Max Weber, his ideal bureaucratic theory, and where it falls on our three different characteristics, my question to you is, what are some of the criticisms, what are some of the limitations of a Weberian ideal bureaucracy?
As you said initially, the red tape.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, a lot of red tape, a lot of rules and regulations. As we said, that can then lead to a lot of goal displacement. So I think that is certainly part and parcel as a criticism of Weber. So absolutely. Any other criticisms of Weber?
Kind of loses sight of the mission or the overall goal.
Yep, absolutely. You got that goal displacement. And so the goal becomes the policies as opposed to serving your constituents. And yeah, you kind of lose sight of that mission. And so if you're just trying to adhere to your policies, then all the goal setting in the world that you can do and all the strategic planning in the world that you can do, if you're not going to actually have a plan to really follow up on achieving that mission and achieving those goals, it's going to all be for naught. And so, yeah, I think you lose the sight of the forest for the trees, as that old saying goes. So I agree with that, absolutely. Anything else? Any other criticisms?
I would say you're more rigid when sometimes you might need to adapt to what's happening.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that's a great point. There's not a whole lot of adaptability built into a idealized bureaucracy. And one of the reasons why there's not a lot of that, beyond just having all these strict rules and regulations, is there's not a whole lot of external perspective. There's not a whole lot of thought about how the organization can affect its environment and how the environment affects the organization. So it is very much an internal focus. And when you are just focusing internal to the organization, I agree. It makes it difficult for you to see how and when and if you should adapt to changes and challenges in your external environment. Those are all great ones. Let's see. Diego says employee morale as well. That's exactly where I was going. So you knew exactly where I was going with this. Folks don't like rigid rules and direct supervision. Yeah, it's very dehumanizing. It's a very dehumanizing approach. It really doesn't take into account this whole more modern idea of human resource development. It doesn't really take into account the importance of incentivizing employees to build their morale and to help them, see how what they're doing on a daily basis can help them in their future careers. So it's very much devoid of any type of a humanistic type of a focus. Yeah, it just really does not recognize that human aspect of organizations. And it does. It really very much looks at the organization as being this machine. So we create this machine, and if this machine works in this setting, then obviously this machine is going to work in every other setting. And that whole idea of dehumanizing approach, the one size fits all, those are two characteristics that really help to connect and tie all of our theorists within this rubric of classical school. Now, I'm going to put all these people within the classical school. As you know from your reading of Tompkins so far, he kind of splits them up. So he has Weber with his ideal bureaucratic theory. He's got Frederick Taylor with his theory of scientific management. He's got Gulick and others as their principles theory. I kind of take all those theories and put them together into the classical approach because they all share those characteristics of trying to find that one size fits all approach and a dehumanizing approach to how we deal with our individual employees. And so that's why I kind of group all these folks together under that one big rubric of the classical school. So speaking of these other folks in the classical school, the second major classical theorist that I'm sure you talked about in PPA 500, I know for certain if you had 500 with me, is our good friend Frederick Taylor. Now, Frederick Taylor was somewhat of, yeah, the least favorite for many people. He was one of my least favorites, and I'll tell you for why in a second. But um, Frederick Taylor was kind of a contemporary with Max Weber in terms of timeline. Frederick Taylor was writing in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. His theories really started to become in vogue and really hit their heyday in the 1920s, where his theories were not only being adopted across private organizations, but also being adopted in public organizations as well. So, as we know, Frederick Taylor is best known for his theory of scientific management. Frederick Taylor, by training and education, was a process-based engineer. So we wouldn't be surprised or shouldn't be surprised that a process-based engineer would be focused on the work processes going on within an organization. So here is one of the major differences between Frederick Taylor and Max Weber. Max Weber looked at the structure of the organization, trying to create that ideal structure, whereas Frederick Taylor focused on specific work processes within organizations. So he was much more process oriented. But again, he is also very much influenced by the Enlightenment era, the whole idea that we can create a science for something in order to better understand it. So he argued that there was a need for the creation of a quote unquote science of management. He felt that if we could come up with this science of management, that's how we can make our organizations efficient. Now, this is another difference between Weber and Taylor. Weber, even though he did look at efficiency, he was interested in making the structure of the organization as effective as possible. Taylor has much more of an efficiency type of focus. Now, obviously, efficiency and effectiveness can be related to each other. That if you create efficiency in your work processes, you can then enhance productivity. If you enhance productivity, then you have a better chance of achieving your goals. The better you achieve your goals, the more effective you are as an organization. So the two terms are certainly not divorced from each other. They are certainly related to each other, but they're not the same term. Efficiency is trying to create more output with fewer resources, trying to do more with less, as we're always told to do in the public sector and will continue to be told to do. Effectiveness is oftentimes more about achieving the goal of the organization. So he's very process focused. And if we can create this science of management, we can learn how to do all of our processes within our organizations in what he considered to be the one best way. So here is your connection. One best way to structure the organization with Weber, one best way to organize work processes and jobs under Frederick Taylor. So one looked at structure, the other one's looking at jobs. They were both looking for that one best way to do things. So the reason why he felt someone needed to develop a science for management is that when he was doing the development of his theories, he was looking around at our factories and all of our industries that had been growing up after the Industrial Revolution. And he recognized that there were three major problems in those factories and in those industries. The one major problem was they were bereft of middle managers, that we didn't have the level of middle management that we see today in our organizations. That was not present when Frederick Taylor was developing his theories. You essentially had your line employees, your line workers who were creating the output on a daily basis. Then you had leadership, but you really didn't have that middle level of management, that middle level of management that could oversee and help direct those employees to try and make the jobs more efficient, and then therefore make those employees more productive. So he wanted to kind of create this level of middle managers. Secondly, because we did not have this middle management type of level, there was very little supervision and guidance that was being provided to employees. So if employees didn't know how to do the job in the one best way, they're clearly not going to do the job in the one best way. So they're not going to be efficient. They're not going to be productive. And there's really no one in close proximity to them to tell them how to be efficient and how to be productive. That's why you need that level of middle management. And then third, all the labor unrest that we saw in a lot of our industries at the time. You think about something like The Jungle by Upton Sinclair that was published in 1906, right while Frederick Taylor was publishing his theories. So he was very well aware of all this labor unrest and all these situations going on within our organizations that were certainly eroding from productivity, eroding from efficiency, and really leading to a lot of violence and actually death within those organizations. So he looked at those three different factors and said to himself, I need to develop a scientific way to study management. So he develops this theory of scientific management. Now, scientific management was developed for the private sector. Again, Frederick Taylor was a process-based engineer, so he was focusing on private organizations. And scientific management took hold first and foremost in the private sector, and then eventually made its way over into the public sector throughout the 1920s and the 1930s. When Taylor looked at organizations, he felt that there was a lot of what he referred to as soldiering going on in our organizations. And he was using soldiering as a pejorative term. When he used the term soldiering, he was looking at individual employees who were just doing the bare minimum to get by. So they weren't going to try and work harder. They're not trying to give back to the organization. They're going to do as little as possible just to not get in trouble. Since there's no level of middle management there and there's very little supervision and guidance provided to these employees, they could get away with soldiering. So in his scientific management, he wanted to establish and define performance standards that could then be applied to these individuals to eliminate this process known as soldiering. He believed that in scientific management, we could establish scientific standards for selecting the quote unquote right employee for a job. So we could establish standards for the knowledge, skills, and abilities needed in order for that individual to do this one job on a daily basis. He believed in scientific management, we could set standards to systematize the production process. So we systematize the process so that everyone who is doing that job is doing the job in that same way, in that one best way to do the job. He also felt with the scientific management approach, we could systematize all the tools that are used in the production of the output. So everyone's using the same tools who are doing the same jobs on a daily basis. Essentially, you would have this one best way to do the job. So what you could do is scientifically, you could study each individual job, each individual work process, deconstruct that job into its component elements, determine what are the most efficient ways of doing the job, combining all those most efficient ways together into what he defined as the one best way to do the job. Once you've identified scientifically the one best way to do the job, you then go out there and hire people who have the skills to be able to do that job in the one best way. Once you hire those people, you train them in the one best way to do the job. You then supervise them and make sure they're doing the job in that one best way. If they're doing the job in the one best way, you provide them with remuneration. You provide them with pay for their performance. If, however, they're not doing the job in the one best way, you eliminate them from the organization. One of the reasons why I really do not like Frederick Taylor is a lot of the language he used to refer to employees. If you had me for 500, we talked about this, but he, in his writing, referred to employees as being what he called boorish beasts. These are boorish beasts. These are people who really can't think for themselves. They have to be told what to do. Boorish beast is about as pejorative a term as you can think of to describe a human being. He also referred to employees as being cogs in the machinery. So if the machinery is not running efficiently, it's probably not running efficiently because there is a broken cog in that machinery. And so, you picture the machinery, all these cogs have a series of teeth on them. As a cog turns, a tooth on that cog then hits on the tooth of another cog, which turns that cog, which then does the same thing to another cog, and so on and so on. Think about like a watch and how that old time watch would work. And so, if you've got a broken cog, you got a cog that has a broken tooth, you pull it out of the watch, you throw it away, and you replace it with a new cog, and the machinery then runs efficiently again. So people are just merely cogs within the machinery. So in order to develop this scientific approach to management, he believed that what we need to do is we need to go out there and conduct what he calls these time motion studies. See, Muhammad said, George Carlin says most people work just hard enough not to get fired and get paid just enough money not to quit. I like that. I like a lot of George Carlin quotes. I think that's a good one as well. And so that's your process of soldiering. So he believes we can do these time motion studies. So what we will do is we will literally have what today would be known as a performance specialist or productivity specialist who would stand behind someone doing a job and would record all of the movements that person engaged in doing the job. Would then look at all those movements, would look at which movements contributed to productivity and efficiency, which movements detracted from efficiency. The ones that contribute to efficiency, you consider those to be what he called true movements. The ones that detract from efficiency are called false movements. You obviously eliminate the false movements, collect all the true movements together into that one best way to do the job. You then make sure you've hired people who have the skills to do it. You train them in the one best way, and then you manage them with middle managers, supervise them to make sure they're doing it in that one best way. What this also means is that you not only have task specialization for the employees doing the jobs, but you also then have task specialization for those middle managers. You have to train those middle managers in that one best way to do the job as well, so that they can hold their employees accountable for doing the job in the one best way. So, there are a lot of reasons why I'm not a really big fan of Frederick Taylor. Let's see, Emma says, the general main character gets a job at meat packing factory, super time efficient. They just accept that employees are going to be occasionally made because of the speed of the cuts they need to make. Yeah, that's collateral damage. That's just damage that you have to accept in order to be efficient and productive as an organization. That's putting the organization above the individual employee. A very dehumanizing way of looking at employees. And certainly, Frederick Taylor was very familiar with Upton Sinclair and the jungle and those types of descriptions. The job that we oftentimes look at with Frederick Taylor and his development of scientific management was a very simple job of shoveling pig ore. A very simple job where you're literally taking a shovel, picking up a shovel full of pig ore, moving that shovel over to a cart, and then starting over again. Deconstruct that job into all the component elements and then time each one of those movements. How long did it take them to put the shovel into the pile? How long to pick the pile of a shovel full of ore up? How long to then move that shovel full over to the cart? How long to dump it in the cart? How long to come back to the start again and begin? You time every single one of those movements. You look for any movements that are not efficient and non-productive. You get rid of those movements, and then you go ahead and incorporate all the true movements together. It is, from a humanistic perspective, a relatively diabolical way of looking at it. As Diego said, I agree with that. But it is the way in which you come up with this one best way to do the job. And yeah, AJ, you certainly see that engineering background. Certainly coming in that process orientation with Frederick Taylor. So we see Frederick Taylor developing a scientific management theory, applying it in the private sector. It really became very much in vogue in the private sector. And we know that sometimes when things become in vogue in the private sector, it's just a matter of time before people start transferring them over to public organizations. And we started seeing that happen in the 1920s and the 1930s. irrespective of all the limitations and criticisms with Frederick Taylor's scientific management. And we've already highlighted those, so we don't have to go through belabor those much. But again, very dehumanizing. Really believe that there is one best way to do every single job, which obviously is oftentimes not true, especially if you are dealing with individuals. Last week, I think we had talked about this Thompson typology of technology. I just had to say it one more time. And this idea of the type of technology known as an intensive technology. That intensive technology that you are dealing with individuals who have different sets of circumstances and different wants, needs, and desires. And so therefore you may have to deal with them a little bit differently than you would deal with someone else. That's not really accommodated for here in scientific management. So because of those limitations, because of the dehumanizing approach of Frederick Taylor, that is what would eventually then spawn one of our pre-human relations theorists, Mary Parker Follett. Her whole theory was kind of developed as a criticism and a rejoinder to Frederick Taylor in scientific management. So where does scientific management fit in terms of our four models of organizational effectiveness? Well, he is a classical theorist after all, so therefore he'll fall within the rational goal and the internal process models. If again, one of the things I'd like to see in the Tompkins textbook, if it ever gets published again, which I doubt that it will now that he's retired, but I would like to see some gradations in terms of the shading of these cells. I would certainly shade the internal process cell a little bit more heavily than I would the rational goal cell, but it certainly does emphasize both of those models of organizational effectiveness. Not surprisingly to us, they are both located at the bottom of the matrix because there's a big emphasis on top-down control with both of these models. In terms of our mechanisms for coordination and control, we've got a lot of standardization here, obviously. I would say I would have shaded in direct supervision too, because you do have these middle managers who are required to directly supervise these employees, teach them the one best way to do the job. So I would have shaded in direct supervision, but clearly the emphasis on standardization. Standardization of work processes is by far the number one mechanism for controlling work through the one best way to do a job. Standardization of work outputs, also important. I would also argue that standardization of worker skills is also important as well, because we are going out there and we are training people to how to do this job. We're hiring people who have the skill set in order to be able to do the job in the one best way. So we are clearly standardizing the skill set for each group of employees that will be doing a specific type of job. Then in terms of our motivational strategies, clearly there's a lot of legal compliance here. We're telling people how to do it and holding them accountable for doing it. If they don't do the job in the one best way, they're a cog. We remove them from the organization. But if they are doing the job in the one best way, we reward them with reward for performance. So we provide them with additional pay, performance-based pay for doing the job in that one best way. So that is our second classical theorist, Frederick Taylor. Now, again, even though Frederick Taylor's theories are well over a century old, I'm sure you can look in your organization and you can see a lot of vestiges of Frederick Taylor within your organization. I'm not going to get into it too much here because that's one of the things we're going to be looking at in our breakout rooms. So I'll allow each room to think about it and come up with their own answers to that. But just when you look at your organization, I'm sure you can see a whole lot of Weber as well as a whole lot of Taylor. So even though the classical theorists gave us a lot to criticize, and all those criticisms and limitations then provided the jumping off point for all those neoclassical theories, like human relations and human resource management, a lot of the aspects of the classical school are still alive and well in our quote unquote modern organizations. So the third author then that I usually like to talk about when we talk about the classical school is a person by the name of Henri Fayolle. And you may or may not have run into Henri Fayolle before. Whenever Tompkins talks about Henri Fayolle and Mooney and Gulick, he oftentimes refers to it as the School of Administrative Management Theory, which is fair. But I tend to take that school and put it within the classical school just because there are so many similarities between Weber, Taylor, and Fayol, Mooney, and Gullip. Let's talk about some of these administrative management theorists. And again, like I said, begin with Henri Fayol. Now, Henri Fayol is a bit different than Weber and Taylor in that he approaches the study of organizations from a different perspective. So we know that Weber approached it from background as a sociologist, but also with his legal training. We know Taylor approached work processes from his background as an engineer. Fayol kind of brings a more psychological approach to understanding organizations. And so he kind of introduces for really the first time with any real gusto, if you will, the whole idea of a psychological approach to our organizations. What Fayol shares with Weber and Taylor is this search for the one-size-fits-all approach. So he also believed that we can come up with this panacea and apply to the vast majority, if not all, of our organizations. One of the things I do like about Henri Fayol is that he approached our organizations from a more holistic viewpoint of what he considered to be governance. So he makes the argument that in order to make our organizations effective and efficient, we have to look at how we govern those organizations. Governance is a big term, and there are a lot of activities that go into the governance of an organization. The one that we are going to be most interested in here is the management activity. So how leaders manage their employees, how they manage all the different units, everything within their organization. It's going to be the management activities that we are most concerned with. But Fayol argues that management is only one part of the overall governance of the organization. And if you want to do an efficient, effective job governing the organization as a leader, you have to know how to manage the organization. You also have to engage in what he calls technical activities. So the actual production of the outputs of that organization, those are those technical activities. So what types of technologies and techniques need to be used on a daily basis to create the product and the services, the outputs of that organization? So effective leaders will be, and managers will be able to have effective technical processes to create those products. Another part of governance are these commercial activities. And by commercial activities, he's talking about these transactional commercial types of relationships whereby organizations have to get resources. So they have to get money. They have to then exchange their products with individuals and other organizations. So you end up in these commercial types of transactions. So something as simple as in order to get the daily job done, we may need to go out there and buy desks for our employees. And so we go out there and buy these desks from a private sector corporation. That is a commercial type of activity. Financial activities. We have to manage our finances in order to be efficient and effective as an organization. We have to manage our revenues and our expenditures and hopefully be able to balance those revenues and expenditures if we're a nonprofit type of organization or a governmental organization. So we have to properly manage our finances. We have to also manage our security activities. So we will engage in activities to keep our employees secure, to protect our intellectual capital, to make sure that we are protecting whatever product we are creating from competitors. Today, in the world of cybersecurity, security activities have really taken on enhanced prominence in a lot of our organizations. Those are all those security activities we engage in. And accounting activities. And if you are ever engaged in accounting, you know what accounting is all about. You know sometimes how laborious the accounting process may be. We are oftentimes required to conduct audits. Sometimes we're required to conduct those external audits. Sometimes they're annual audits. Sometimes they're audits that are conducted every 6 months. In my district, when we were managing our general obligation bond, our Citizen Oversight Committee had to produce 2 audits per year that had to be presented to the board and accepted by the board. Those audits would be produced by outside auditors, and those auditors would produce those audit reports. Audit reports can get to be very detailed and get to be very difficult to wade through at times. Oftentimes with these audits, we're looking for what we call issues of materiality. So is there something that rises to a big enough level, to an important enough level to be considered to be a material issue? So, if there is one missing receipt or something like that, it's oftentimes not going to be for, a stapler or something like that. It's not going to be a material issue. But if perhaps you have a lack of internal control in that you are not doing a good job as an organization determining who has the ability to go out there and issue purchase orders and spend money, that lack of internal control would certainly rise to the level of being an issue of materiality. So we have to do these audits and account for this public taxpayer money. So governance is the overall concept. And then within governance, we engage in management activities, technical activities, commercial activities, financial activities, security activities, and accounting activities. So I like the way in which FAIL kind of postulates to us that it's really more goes beyond just management and it goes to the actual overall governance of the organization. But for our purposes, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on FAIL's approach to management. And FAIL basically for us defines 5 essential functions of management, 5 essential functions of managers. So here are 5 things that all managers must do. Number 1, all managers must engage in planning. And that's true for all of our organizations. We all engage in strategic planning. We contribute to these strategic plans. Hopefully, we put together action plans to actually execute and carry out these strategic plans, but we all engage in strategic planning. Granted, the planning process in the public sector is often different than the planning process in the private sector. In the public sector, for our public organizations, our planning process tends to be much more lengthy. It tends to have a longer time perspective in that our strategic plans may be plans for 5 or 7 or 10 years. Our plans also are very subject to interventions, what we like to call fire drills. And so something will happen in our external environment that will force us to address it immediately. The opportunity cost will be that we don't have the ability to really focus on our strategic planning process. So there are a lot more interruptions and interventions in public sector strategic planning, but all managers engage in planning. All managers engage in organizing. They have to organize the people in their organizations, the units and divisions, and the work that goes on within the organizations. They all engage in the 3rd essential function of commanding. You have to tell people what to do and make sure that people are following what they're supposed to do on a daily basis. So there is a commanding function of management. The 4th function is coordination. Since we do have all these disparate units and programs and all these different people working in an organization, we have to try and coordinate their efforts to make sure everyone's working toward the same unified goal. And then the final essential function is controlling everything within our organization, whether it be the work done on a daily basis, the finances of the organization, the quality of the product. All those things are part of the controlling function of management. So you can kind of see where this is going. This is going into taking these essential functions and then distilling them into specific principles of management. And these principles are principles that are universal to all of our organizations that we can then teach to all of our managers. And by teaching all these principles to managers, then we will be able to make those managers as efficient and effective as possible. So he takes those 5 essential functions and he uses them to then create all these different discrete principles of management. Some of these principles of management are very common to us because they come directly out of a Weberian type of an approach and a Tayloresque type of an approach. So the first principle, division of work, obviously that comes straight from Max Weber. The second principle of management, authority creates responsibility. This means that when you provide people with the authority over something And once you give them that authority, then they become responsible for it. They feel this sense of responsibility for that authority, for that area of authority. The third one is discipline. So every manager needs to know how to discipline their employees to make sure their employees are being held in legal compliance. Unity of command. So our managers need to create and then foster this unity of command. So everyone knows to whom they are accountable. Again, straight out of Max Weber. Promoting a subordination to the general interest, that the interests of the many outweigh the interests of the fewer one, as Dr. Spock would tell us for all you Star Trek fans. Subordination of personal interests to general interests. Remuneration, this comes straight from Frederick Taylor, so compensating people for a job well done. Centralization, this is straight out of Max Weber and his ideal bureaucracy. Chain of command, straight out of Max Weber and ideal bureaucracy. A sense of order, ditto with Max Weber. Equity comes out of the fair application of rules and regulations and processes. And so that's where this focus on equity comes from. We will talk more about the idea of equity in a couple of weeks when we talk about motivational strategies. And I'll talk to you about different theories of equity, distributional equity and procedural equity. And some theorists, they talk about the equity between inputs and outputs. But it's important that people feel that they're being treated in an equitable manner. Stability of personnel. Again, these are your career employees. Initiative. Now, this is something that kind of takes a step out of the normal box of Weber and Taylor. So here we're talking about providing people with incentives to take the initiative. So in case there is a new way of doing something, that they are able to take the initiative to go out there and actually attempt it. And then finally is this esprit de corps. And you're probably familiar with the term esprit de corps. Esprit de corps is kind of this psychological feeling that we are all in this together, that we're all part of this organization. We're all working together as part of this organization to try and make the organization effective and efficient. That esprit de corps is really what then harkens back to this psychological approach of Henri Fayolle, because that is very psychological in nature. So Fayolle is telling us here are these discrete principles of management. If we can teach these principles to all of our managers, that's how we will make effective and efficient managers, which then in turn will make for effective and efficient organizations. So how do we go out there and implement these principles? This is where you get your basic survey, plan, report type of cycle. You've probably seen 1,000 times if you've ever taken business or management courses. The survey step is we have to go out there and understand what is going on within our organization. We survey our organization to look for things that are working well and things that are not working well. We then take the results from that survey and we incorporate them into our strategic plan. We then put that plan into a report. Everyone gets that plan. And then we review that plan as we are implementing to, again, see what is working and what is not working. We write all that information down so we can feed that information back through the process, so we can feed all that feedback back into a new survey once we've implemented our new strategies to see how those new strategies are working. And we have to have all this built within our organization structure, our organization chart, where we can document who is responsible for what. So who's engaging in what activities, who is responsible for the accomplishment of what in terms of making our organizations effective and efficient. So this is why Fayolle, I like to consider him as part of the principle school, because he really does provide us with these discrete principles that if we teach these principles to all of our employees, that's how we create efficiency and effectiveness. So again, Fayolle is sharing that one-size-fits-all approach of our other classical theorists of Weber and Taylor. Then we have Mooney. Mooney is very similar to Fayolle in terms of his belief in the principles of an organization. But the big difference is that whereas Fayolle focused on and incorporated psychological things such as initiative and the esprit de corps, Mooney is much more of a Weberian structuralist. So he really focuses on the principles of the structure of the organization. And for Mooney, there are basically three main principles of organization structures. The first principle is the coordinative principle. So this borrows directly from Fayol, who borrowed directly from the other classical theorists. So this coordinative principle means that all managers need to have a structure that allows them the ability to coordinate the work that's going on within that organization. The second structural principle is the scalar chain. This is this chain of command that we get from Max Weber. There needs to be an identifiable scalar chain so everyone knows to whom they are accountable. And then the third principle of organization structure, that is the one that Mooney is best known for, is what's known as his functional principle. The functional principle is where Mooney actually differentiates between employees. So here, kind of for the first time, we're differentiating between two different categories, two different types of employees. There are line employees and there are staff employees. Line employees are the employees who are actually producing the outputs of the organization. So these line employees are the ones who are actually interfacing and interacting with clients, for instance, with citizens. These are what Michael Lipsky refers to as those street level bureaucrats. They're doing the actual work of the organization. Then you have a second category of employee, which is a staff employee. A staff employee is an employee who is providing the resources that are necessary for the line employee to do their job. So if you have a position that is a finance manager or a budget manager, they may not be interfacing directly with your clients, but they are providing the resources that are necessary for that line employee to go out there and interface and provide those types of goods and services. Yeah, but the coordinative principle is essentially the ability of a manager to coordinate all the people within the organization, all the resources in the organization, and all the work that's being done. So basically saying a major principle of organization is that it's structured in a way that allows this manager to be able to coordinate all the work that's occurring underneath them. And that's what's called this coordinative type of principle. But again, it's really this functional principle that is the most important one, because this is what Mooney is best known for. Still today in our organizations, we still make this differentiation between a line employee and a staff employee. Line employee who's actually doing the production of that good or service, interfacing with the clients, the beneficiaries, and the staff employee who will be providing the resources to make that line person's job possible. So it's kind of similar to this whole idea of provision and production. So production is being done by the line employee, provision, giving the resources, that's what's being done by the staff employee. Well, the big question here is, well, so what? What's the benefit of differentiating between line and staff employees? Here, Mooney is telling us kind of one of the first times that different types of employees need different types of things. They need different types of resources. They need different types of treatment by their leaders and their managers. They need different type of supervision. They need different type of support. So different types of positions will have different needs and different desires. That's kind of a step toward where we'll end up getting with the neoclassical theorists like human relations and human resource management, where we not only differentiate between different types of employees, but we actually start to differentiate between different individual employees. So this is kind of a step that will eventually take us to the neoclassical human relations and human resource management types of approaches. So kind of recap with Fayol and Mooney, the big difference, Fayol was more psychological, Mooney was more focused on structural, but what they share with Weber and Taylor is this kind of almost myopic view on finding the one best theory to apply in every single given situation. And then our next and the final classical theorist that we typically focus on tonight is our good friend Luther Gulick, who again I know you covered in your 500 class. Luther Gulick is important for a couple of reasons. One of the main reasons why Luther Gulick is important is because he really is kind of our first public administration theorist. He's one who developed his theory for public organizations. And then, secondly, not only developed them for public organizations, but had the unique opportunity to actually apply them directly to public organizations. And through his work on the Brownlow Commission in the 1930s, he was able to take some of his theories and apply them directly to the reorganization of the federal bureaucracy that came in that Reorganization Act as a result of the work of the Brownlow Commission. Brownlow Commission was created to try and provide the president with more tools and more ability to manage this ever-increasing federal bureaucracy. In the wake of the New Deal, we obviously had the creation of all these agencies and all these different programs. I don't want to belabor this because you probably heard this before, but that led to this explosion in the size of the federal bureaucracy. As the federal bureaucracy gets so large, it becomes really unwieldy and pretty much impossible for a singular president to be able to effectively manage this entire bureaucracy. So instead, what we end up with is we end up with the creation of the Brownlow Commission to make these recommendations to try and make the federal bureaucracy easier to manage. And we won't go into all the things we have today that came as a result of it. But one of the major things that came out of the Executive Office of the President is the Executive Office of the President. And so out of the Brownlow Commission, we have this idea of reorganizing the bureaucracy so we can take all of these management-oriented agencies and we can place them within this umbrella known as the Executive Office of the President, or the EOP. Then the president can have direct access to all these management agencies directly through this Executive Office of the President. So the president can better manage the Bureau of the Budget, which was the antecedent to what we have today in the Office of Management and Budget. The president today can better manage the Office of Personnel Management as a management type of agency. The president can manage the White House office, the Office of National Drug Control Policy. All those management types of organizations are now directly linked to the president through this Executive Office of the President. But Gulick, in his theories, really felt that, again, we could develop some discrete principles that if we taught these principles to every single one of our managers, those managers could then go out there on a daily basis and effectively and efficiently apply these principles to make our organizations more effective and efficient. So we again have this one-size-fits-all approach, which puts him into the classical school, and he's giving us these discrete principles, which really aligns him very closely with both Henri Fayol as well as Mooney. So Gulick's principles, we know, have come to be known by the acronym of POSCOR. In the 500 class, you talked about POSCOR when you talked about the Graham Allison article. POSCOR are these principles of planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. POSDRCB. Some people will call it POSDCORB with the CO for coordinating. But these are the primary principles that are shared by both public and private organizations. This is what Allison refers to and we refer to as being the generic management functions. So these are the functions that are done by all organizations. Gulick referred to these as his principles of management. So the idea here is all of these principles form what Gulick would refer to as kind of a managerial toolkit. So if we can teach our managers to plan, how to organize, how to staff, how to direct, how to coordinate, how to report, and how to budget, provide them with all that skill set, put all that into this managerial toolkit, give it to our managers, then whenever managers are on the job, they can then, depending upon the situation in which they face, reach in that toolkit and pull out the tool that they need to use. So sometimes you need to focus on planning. Sometimes you need to focus on getting people into your organization through staffing. Sometimes you have to focus on getting money into your organization through budgeting. And so you've got all these principles that you understand. You then know when to pull them out and use them on a daily basis. Now, the principal school obviously makes sense to us, and these are still generic principles that apply to all of our organizations, both public as well as private. But just like with all of our other classical theories, there are critiques of the principal school. Two of the major critiques come from a couple of very prominent public administration scholars, Herb Simon and Dwight Waldo. Herb Simon, actually, if you've ever had Dr. Baber in the program, after our hooding ceremony this year, we were kind of sitting around talking, and Dr. Baber was actually sharing a story about how one of his first articles that he wrote was actually a criticism of Herb Simon's book. And he said he, wrote this article and he gave a presentation criticizing Herb Simon's book. And he said he then, a couple weeks later, received a 30-page letter from Herb Simon talking about where Dr. Baber was wrong in terms of his critique and why Dr. Baber was wrong. And I guess they then ended up, it was a mini book, ended up kind of forming a friendship between the two, between senior faculty with Herb Simon and junior faculty with Dr. Baber. But Herb Simon is very well known. He's written a lot in public administration. He is oftentimes known for critiquing the work of others, which is kind of ironic to see him kind of bristle a bit at having his work critiqued, because he's very well known as critiquing theories that have been developed by other people. Here, Herb Simon is critiquing Gulick's principal school. And his critique of the principal school is that these are not really universal principles. Instead, Simon referred to them as proverbs, and very much in a disparaging way. So he says, when you think about a proverb is basically a story. And you can find any story to counter another story. So there's always another proverb out there that can counter the proverb that you are offering. So he's basically saying these are not universal principles. They are more stories that are not really something that we can teach our managers and expect them to always adhere to, because one can always cancel the other one out. If you're planning, does that mean that you're not also budgeting? Because whenever we put our strategic plans together, we have to be very mindful of the amount of money it's going to take to carry out all these different actions. Dwight Waldo, the second critic of principal school, is again a very well-known author in public administration. I'm sure you've run into him before in the program. Here, Waldo also takes issues with the principles and refers to those principles as being prescriptions, being normative prescriptions. And we know that when something is normative, when we ask a normative question or we make a normative statement, we are asking or we're saying, this is how it ought to be. This is how it should be. And Waldo is saying that these are prescriptions, these are normative. They are not scientific principles. He said that these are prescriptions that are value laden. And they are value laden in that they are meant to try and perpetuate the values of executive control and centralization. He essentially is making the argument that Gulick will be using these principles in order to foster centralization and top-down decision-making within our organizations, which is pretty much the antithesis of everything that we are going to talk about when we get to neoclassical theories such as human resource management. Also, the principal schools suffer from the same problem that we had with the other classical theories, and that was the lack of the ability to have a one-size-fits-all approach. It's just impossible to have that one universal approach that fits in every single situation. Now, before we get to the breakout groups, though, let's kind of wrap up this discussion of Fayol, Mooney, and Gulick and their principal school by going back, as we do with everything, and looking at the models of organizational effectiveness that they favor. Clearly here, we're still on the control part of the matrix. So we've got rational goal model, we have internal process model, very much a top-down type of control orientation. In terms of our mechanisms for coordination control, there's a lot of direct supervision here. There is standardization of principles, but there's a lot of this direct supervision, very much of a top-down centralizing approach, as Dwight Waldo tells us. Then in terms of our motivational strategies, clearly it's going to be the first one, legal compliance. We are telling people what to do, and then we are controlling and commanding, coordinating their types of activities. It's a very top-down centralizing approach to how we run our organizations. So taken together, those theorists within the classical school all share this one-size-fits-all approach, and they all share a relatively dehumanizing approach to how we treat human employees. The thread that connects them together is that what differentiates them, I'm sorry, that differentiates these theories from each other. Weber focuses on structure. Taylor focuses on work processes. Fail, Mooney, and Gulick all focus on these universal principles that we can teach our managers to try and make our organizations effective and efficient. And if you want to drill down into the principle school, what differentiates Fail and Mooney is Fail is much more structural, is much more psychological, and Mooney is much more structural. So Fail is psychological, and Mooney is very structural. But another final takeaway is that when we are looking at through the development and evolution of the organization theory literature, we are really looking for where did these theories really start to apply in public administration? And that's where Luther Gulick really starts to stand out, because now here for one of the first times, we truly have a public organization theorist in Luther Gulick who developed his theories for public organizations and had the ability to apply them directly to those public organizations. So that was a 90-minute tour de force of a trip through the development of the classical school of organization theory, running from the late 1800s up through into the 1940s, 50-ish. That's what we consider to be the classic school of organization theory. Now, I know I've been talking for a long time. I apologize for that. We are at 7:30, so we are due for a break. So let's go ahead and take a break take a break till 7:45. Come back at 7:45, and then if you have any questions or need any clarifications on the classical school, we can deal with those at that point. And then we'll move into our breakout rooms. And as you can see, I have an exercise on here for us. I'll break you up into probably 3 different breakout rooms, and then we'll have each room talk about their organizations and locate some of these classic organization theories that you tend to see within your organizations. But first off, take a break, come back at 7:45, and then we'll do our breakout rooms. Okay, 7:45, so we are back. Before we do our breakout rooms, are there any questions or clarifications or anything on these classical theorists that we have talked about up to this point tonight? So when you get to 697 and you are doing your organization theory case study, these are some of the people, along with the others we'll talk about in this class, that you'll want to try and incorporate into your answer to the case study and try and relate some of these theorists to the situation you're presented with in that case study. So that's how they're going to kind of come back to haunt you when you get to 697. So let's do our breakout rooms. And so I see we've lost a few folks. That's okay. Instead of 3 rooms, we'll do 2 rooms. I think that'll probably expedite the process of it a bit. So what I'm asking each of our rooms to do is to examine your organizations and identify aspects of classic organization theory. By that, I mean, maybe if you could just give me an example of, we'll say 3 examples of classic organization theory that you see in your organizations. I think 3 would certainly be sufficient to kind of get our discussion going. Each group should also then select a spokesperson, as always, so that you can share out the results from your group once we reconvene at the end of this. Like we did last week, we'll look at maybe about 30 minutes or so working in our groups, and then we will reconvene as a class, share out what each group came up with, and then I think that'll probably take us pretty much to the end of our time tonight, and we can call it quits. So I've created 2 rooms, and it looks like we have 5 people in each room. So I will open up the rooms, and then you can meet and come up with your answers. So the rooms are open, so feel free to go to your rooms. Welcome back, everyone. I think we're all back from the breakout rooms into the main room. So in our last few minutes together, let's go ahead and see what each group came up with. And so we will start with group number 1. If there
I'll be
was,
speaking on behalf of group number 1.
okay, thank you.
Okay, so 3/4 of our group work at CSULB, and many of them work in programs or departments that have programs with limited funding. So Taylor's element or principle of scientific management, they have very standardized processes by which they have to process applications. And that also plays into some of the institutional rigidity that Weber mentions, because there's a lot of written documentation about how the process goes through. And even when a conclusion might better serve the program's goals, they have to stick to the rigid documentation. Another aspect of Weber's description of classical elements of organization theory were more of those standardization of work processes and also how the hierarchy works. So sort of similar to just general hierarchy, Mooney's hierarchy or his idea of a scalar chain where someone's always responding to someone above and below them if they're at a managerial level. In my organization and at CSULB kind of works that way up the chain. And those are the elements we identified.
Done. Yeah, Cal State Long Beach is very much a bureaucracy. I mean, you know that if you work here, you know that since you all go to school here, it's very much a bureaucracy. There is scientific management. We have a tall hierarchy. We have, Emma mentioned a scalar chain. We certainly are experiencing institutional rigidity in many respects. It's kind of your classical, large, kind of becoming older bureaucratic organization and all the dysfunctions that tend to come with that. But there are some advantages. And we're talking about processing applications. There are steps that you must go through, obviously, and there's oversight of that. But hopefully, it will be allowed to be done in a much more equitable fashion, protecting individual rights. And so there are always positives and negatives of seeing these classical elements. But certainly when you get to your final assessment, you're looking at Cal State Long Beach. The first question that you're going to be answering on the classical elements will be a very easy one to answer because there are a lot of classical elements here at Cal State Long Beach. So well done. Thank you very much. And we'll go with room number 2.
Hi, my name is Lindsay, and I'll be speaking on behalf of group number 2. So most of us do work in public organizations, and the top 2 characteristics that we found were the division of labor, where a lot of our roles had specialization. So like, for example, in the graduation office, student assistants will process graduation applications. The evaluators will audit degrees. We had one person who works in a private school. And even there's a lot of specialization and division of labor where, certain teachers specialize in a certain topic. And yeah, so like there's no crossing over really, is what we found. And the second thing that we all kind of hit on was hierarchy of authority. So there's a chain of command pretty much when we all kind of talked about our organizations. So for example, like we mentioned, like student assistants, they go to the coordinator when they, need to, I guess like they report to the coordinator. supervisors report to managers. And so we see like a lot of like upper decisions kind of flowing down to like the different levels. And the last point that we all kind of agreed on that we kind of saw was efficiency and productivity. So in all of our organizations, we have specific like processes to maximize efficiency. So like we have like a lot of like standardized like email templates for like easier communication system wide in our organizations. Um, for example, like in the graduation office, we have like batch processing for like awarding students. Um, somebody, I think it was um, somebody that was like in a private high school talked about they have like specific processes for like giving like IEPs and like what would constitute that and like they have like different handbooks that they kind of work off of and like a lot of paperwork. So those were the top three that we saw.
Very good.
That's it.
Good job. And yeah, these it's an interesting. I saw a few people in Canvas SA2 talking about public versus private schools and pointing out some similarities and differences. It really is kind of striking the similarities that you do have. And oftentimes you have those similarities, as you mentioned, Liz, because of the need for task specialization, position classifications. And so you'll have a stepping column system. And that stepping column system is a position classification system that then assigns pay grades for each different type of position so that you have equality in terms of pay and you're getting paid based upon the content of the job that is being done. And we see that frequently in private as well as in the public sector. Those position classification systems are really what fuels that task specialization that we oftentimes see in organizations. Um, Having served on a school board, I know the IEP process. And I know, as you mentioned, just how difficult it is and how many regulations, how many requirements are involved in the IEP process. And so that's a really good example of written documentation and adherence to rules and regulations, and sometimes can introduce some rigidity into the process. So very well done. Yeah, and I think it is striking. Just about any organization we look at that we refer to as a modern organization will have examples of these classical theories. And so when we talk about neoclassical theories starting next week, the primary impetus for those neoclassical theories was always the problems with classical theories. And so we have this whole litany of all these disadvantages and all these limitations and critiques of classical theories, but yet that doesn't preclude us from still relying upon those classical theories in our modern day organizations. And that's especially true if anyone works in a paramilitary organization. Those paramilitary organizations tend to really exemplify a lot of those classical theories, more so than you might see in a social services agency or maybe a small nonprofit organization. But regardless of the organization, we still have a lot of those vestiges of classical theories in our organizations. But next week, what we'll do is we will talk at length about how the neoclassical theorists address those limitations in the classical school and how all of those criticisms then gave rise to these neoclassical theories. And the neoclassical theories are essentially just the theories that were developed after the classical theories, usually in response to the criticisms assigned to those classical theories. So what we'll do next week is we'll then move our discussion forward to neoclassical schools. We'll do the School of Human Relations. We'll do the School of Human Resource Management Theory. And then also next week, we'll talk motivation theory, because motivation theory fits in very nicely with these neoclassical schools of HR and HRM. But motivational theories, that's something that's not going to be covered necessarily at great length by Tompkins. So that's going to be a little bit of outside information that I'm going to bring in for you next week. And we'll kind of fold motivational theories in with our discussion of human relations and human resource management. So that is what we're planning on doing for next week, right? Let's see, it's 8:30, so I think we're about done for the evening. Obviously, no time to go into neoclassical tonight. So next week will be all neoclassical theories. We'll do our same approach. I'll talk about neoclassical theories. We'll discuss it. We'll have a break, and then we'll do our breakout rooms in the second half of the session. Thank you very much for being here. I'll have the recording up on our Canvas site no later than sometime tomorrow afternoon. I hope everyone has a great week, and I will talk to you again next Tuesday. So take care. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Dr.
Thank you. Good
Powell.
night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.